For centuries, war followed familiar rules. Armies marched in formation, believing discipline, courage, and numbers could still determine victory. Battles were brutal, but they were expected to end. War, however cruel, was something humans believed they could control. Then came one battle that destroyed that belief forever. This was not simply a clash of armies. It was the moment when traditional warfare met industrial power on an unimaginable scale. Artillery thundered 4 days without pause. Machine guns erased lives in seconds. Poison gas turned the air itself into a weapon. Soldiers no longer fought for cities or victory, but for shattered ground measured in meters. When the fighting ended, millions were dead or wounded. Yet the true impact went far beyond the casualties. This battle revealed a terrifying truth. War had become a machine, driven by technology, endurance, and relentless destruction. From that moment on, war would never be the same. Before this battle, war was still imagined through the lens of the past. Military academies taught doctrines shaped by earlier conflicts, where speed, maneuver, and decisive engagements were believed to bring victory. Generals planned campaigns expecting that bold offensives would break enemy lines and force surrender. Even as technology advanced, many leaders remained convinced that the human spirit would always outweigh machines. At the outbreak of the Great War, this confidence was everywhere. Nations mobilized with enthusiasm and certainty. Young men marched to the front believing the war would be over by winter. Politicians promised quick victories. Newspapers spoke of honor, duty, and sacrifice, rarely questioning whether modern weapons had already changed the nature of combat itself. What few truly understood was how deeply industrialization had transformed warfare. Factories no longer produced goods only for civilian life. They produced shells by the millions, rifles by the tens of thousands, and artillery pieces capable of firing farther and longer than ever before. Railways allowed entire armies to be moved with terrifying speed. Communication systems meant commanders could coordinate forces across vast distances. War was no longer limited by human endurance alone. It was powered by machines that did not tire. When the fighting began, the old strategies collapsed almost immediately. Infantry advanced as they had in previous wars, moving in dense formations across open ground. They were met not by scattered rifle fire, but by machine guns capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute. Entire units were cut down before they could reach the enemy. Courage did not matter. Discipline did not matter. Numbers only increased the scale of the slaughter. Artillery soon became the dominant force on the battlefield. Guns fired day and night, pounding the earth into mud and debris. Shells did not merely kill. They destroyed roads, trenches, and landscapes, turning once fertile land into barren wastelands. Soldiers learned to fear the sound of incoming fire more than the sight of the enemy. Death could come without warning, without a face, without a chance to fight back. As casualties mounted, armies dug into the ground for survival. Trenches stretched for miles, carving scars across the countryside. Life within them was a constant struggle against cold, disease, and exhaustion. Mud swallowed boots, and sometimes men themselves. Rats fed on the remains of the dead. Sleep came in short, uneasy moments interrupted by explosions and screams. Between the opposing trenches lay a strip of land that would become infamous. It was a place stripped of all life, churned by shells and soaked with blood. Crossing it meant near certain death. Yet soldiers were ordered to advance again and again, knowing the outcome before they climbed out of the trench. Victory was measured not in breakthroughs, but in meters gained at the cost of thousands of lives. Chemical weapons introduced a new terror. Poison gas drifted silently across the battlefield, burning lungs and blinding eyes. Gas masks offered limited protection, but panic spread faster than the fumes. The idea that even the air could kill shattered any remaining sense of safety. War had entered a realm where survival depended as much on equipment as on courage. Commanders struggled to adapt. Communication between the front lines and headquarters was slow and unreliable. Orders were often outdated by the time they arrived. Generals far from the fighting planned offensives based on maps and reports, unable to fully grasp the conditions faced by the men at the front. Each failed attack was followed by another, driven by the belief that persistence alone would eventually bring success. What emerged was a war of attrition. The goal was no longer rapid victory. but the gradual exhaustion of the enemy. Battles lasted not hours or days, but months. Losses were expected and accepted as part of the strategy. Human lives became numbers on reports, resources to be spent in pursuit of an uncertain outcome. For the soldiers, time seemed to lose meaning. Days blurred into weeks under constant threat. The noise never truly stopped. The ground trembled even during moments of quiet. Many began to suffer from psychological wounds that were poorly understood at the time. Fear, shock, and trauma followed them long after the fighting ended, though few spoke of it openly. Civilians at home were slowly confronted with the reality of what was happening. Casualty lists grew longer. Entire communities lost a generation of young men. The promises of a short and glorious war rang hollow as the conflict dragged on with no clear end in sight. Faith in old ideas of warfare began to crumble. This battle did not stand alone. It became the symbol of a new kind of conflict, one defined by industry, technology, and mass destruction. It showed that modern war was no longer a test of bravery between opposing armies, but a system that consumed everything in its path. Nations could mobilize entire societies for war, but controlling the consequences was another matter entirely. By the time this battle reached its final stages, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The rules that once governed war no longer applied. The cost of victory had become almost indistinguishable from defeat, and the world was only beginning to understand what that meant. Have you ever wondered when war stopped being about courage and started being about machines? Let's travel back to a time when battlefields were utterly transformed, creating a new kind of conflict that still shapes our world today. It became terrifyingly clear that human will alone no longer decided the outcome. Technology had seized control. The battlefield wasn't a line of soldiers anymore. It was a sprawling landscape of machines operating beyond human limits of endurance, emotion, or mercy. The scale of destruction was something the world had never witnessed before. Artillery was king. It dominated everything. Millions upon millions of shells rained down, some landing miles from their targets, others striking with horrific precision. Entire villages vanished under the relentless bombardment. Forests that had stood for centuries were blasted into fields of splintered stumps, and the very ground seemed alive, erupting without warning as explosions tore through the soil. Soldiers quickly learned that survival was often a matter of pure chance, not skill. And the noise. It was overwhelming, a constant, deafening thunder of guns that shattered nerves and broke concentration. Veterans described it as living inside a storm that never, ever ended. Even during the rare moments of silence, the quiet felt unnatural, heavy with the threat of the next barrage. The mind could find no rest, and this unending pressure eventually broke even the strongest of men. Then there were the machine guns. They made movement itself a death sentence. Any attempt to cross open ground was met with a scythe of bullets that could cut down dozens of soldiers in seconds. Traditional tactics, like advancing in waves, became utterly useless. Each wave just met the same fate as the one before. The battlefield punished predictability and rewarded almost nothing. In response to this brutal stalemate, tanks rumbled onto the scene. They were crude, slow, and often broke down, but they represented something revolutionary. For the first time, machines were built specifically to cross treacherous trenches, crush barbed wire, and shield soldiers from the hail of small arms fire. Even though these early models were unreliable, their mere presence signaled a future where armored vehicles would become central to land warfare. The sky above the battlefield was also changing forever. Aircraft, once used mostly for reconnaissance, were now armed. Pilots engaged in deadly dogfights high above the trenches, while bombs began to fall on positions below. For the soldiers on the ground, this meant that death could now strike from above, adding a terrifying new dimension to the conflict. Suddenly, nowhere felt safe. Perhaps the most insidious new weapon was gas. Chemical weapons introduced a deeper, more personal kind of fear. Gas attacks didn't always kill instantly. Instead, they caused slow, agonizing suffering, leaving victims blinded or gasping for breath long after the attack. Protective gear improved over time, but in the early days, many were caught completely unprepared. Panic would spread like wildfire as soldiers fumbled with their masks, choking and disoriented. The psychological impact was immense. Soldiers lost trust in the very air they breathed. Behind the lines, the medical systems were completely overwhelmed. Field hospitals operated under constant, unbearable pressure, treating an endless stream of wounded men. Surgeons worked without rest, often forced to make impossible choices about who could be saved and who couldn't. Amputations were horrifyingly common, and infection claimed many who had initially survived their injuries. Despite advances in medicine, the sheer number of casualties simply outpaced the ability to care for them. The war effort reached far beyond the front. Entire economies were reorganized to feed the insatiable appetite of the battle. Factories ran day and night, churning out weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Civilians became an integral part of the war machine. Women flooded into industrial jobs once reserved for men. Even children were put to work, collecting materials for the cause. The war reached into every home, transforming daily life for everyone, no matter how far they were from the fighting. For the leaders, the pressure was immense. Casualty numbers soared with no clear progress to show for it. Public confidence began to crack. Yet, the thought of withdrawing was unthinkable. Too much had already been sacrificed. Commanders were trapped by the belief that stopping would mean admitting that all those lives had been lost for nothing. This grim logic drove the fighting onward, long after any realistic hope of a decisive breakthrough had vanished. Among the soldiers, a deep disillusionment set in. The initial enthusiasm and patriotism evaporated, replaced by a grim day-to-day determination to simply survive. They no longer spoke of glorious victory. They spoke of endurance. The bonds between comrades became the most important thing in the world, stronger than any loyalty to distant leaders or abstract national ideals. Your survival depended entirely on the person next to you, not on some grand strategy devised miles away. The landscape itself became a powerful symbol of this new kind of war. Once green fields were transformed into a lifeless, alien terrain, pocked with craters and littered with the debris of battle. Water sources were contaminated. The dead were often buried where they fell, their graves marked only by a broken rifle or a shallow mound of earth. Nature itself struggled to recover, a haunting mirror of the psychological damage carried by the survivors. As the months bled into years, it became undeniable that this battle wasn't just an exception. It was a chilling premonition. The methods and technologies used here would shape every major conflict to come. War was no longer limited by geography or season. It was continuous, industrial, and total. It was a cycle of destruction that, once started, was incredibly difficult to stop. Military planners from around the world studied the battle in minute detail, desperately searching for lessons. Some focused on the new technologies. Others analyzed the catastrophic failures in command and communication. But the most important lesson was the one that was impossible to ignore. Modern war had grown beyond human control. It now moved according to its own cold logic, driven by industrial production and a nation's ability to absorb staggering losses. By the time this phase of the battle ended, the question was no longer about who would win, but about what kind of world would be left in the aftermath. For the victor, there was only exhaustion. For the loser, there was total collapse. Either way, the cost was irreversible. The battle had proven, once and for all, that humanity had created a form of conflict far more powerful than its ability to manage it. The transformation was complete. War was no longer just a contest between armies. It had become a brutal test of entire societies, and the price would continue to be paid long after the final guns fell silent. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into the history of warfare interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. See you next time. When the battle finally drew to a close, there was no sense of triumph. There were no celebrations, no clear feeling of victory that could justify the scale of suffering endured. What remained was exhaustion, grief, and a deep awareness that something fundamental had been broken. The battle had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. For the soldiers who survived, returning home did not mean leaving the war behind. Many carried wounds that would never heal, both visible and unseen. Physical injuries changed lives permanently, while psychological trauma followed them into peace. Nightmares, anxiety, and emotional numbness became common, even though few had the words to describe what they were experiencing. Society was unprepared to understand the cost that modern war had imposed on the human mind. Nations, too, were forever changed. Entire regions had been destroyed, their infrastructure shattered beyond recognition. Towns near the battlefield were left abandoned or reduced to ruins. Farmland was poisoned by unexploded shells and chemicals, making recovery slow and dangerous. The environment itself bore scars that would remain for decades, long after the last soldiers had gone. Politically, the battle forced leaders to confront uncomfortable truths. The belief that war could be used as a quick solution to political problems was no longer credible. Decision-makers now understood that modern conflict demanded total commitment and total sacrifice. Any future war would involve entire populations, entire economies, and entire generations. The cost was no longer measured only in territory gained or lost, but in the survival of nations themselves. Military thinking underwent a profound transformation. Old doctrines based on massed infantry assaults were re-examined and often abandoned. Armies began to emphasize mobility, coordination, and technological innovation. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized units moved from experimental tools to essential components of future warfare. Command structures evolved, seeking better communication and flexibility in the face of rapidly changing conditions. At the same time, the battle left behind a dangerous lesson. It showed that industrialized societies could sustain enormous losses and continue fighting. This realization would influence future conflicts, encouraging leaders to believe that endurance alone could bring victory. In some cases, the memory of this battle did not prevent future wars. Instead, it shaped how those wars were fought, often with even greater destructive potential. For civilians, the battle shattered any remaining distance between home and front line. Families learned that war was no longer something fought far away by professional soldiers. It reached into factories, schools, and households. Food shortages, rationing, and economic disruption became part of daily life. Mourning became a shared experience, as nearly every community lost sons, brothers, and fathers. The cultural impact was equally powerful. Writers, artists, and thinkers struggled to make sense of what had happened. Traditional ideas of heroism and glory felt hollow when confronted with the reality of industrial slaughter. Literature and art from the period reflected disillusionment and grief rather than celebration. A generation questioned the values that had led them into such devastation. International relations were reshaped as well. The battle influenced peace negotiations and post-war settlements. Even when it was not explicitly mentioned, leaders were haunted by the fear of repeating such destruction, yet also constrained by unresolved tensions and competing ambitions. The balance between deterrence and aggression became a central concern in global politics. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the battle was its warning. It demonstrated that technological progress, when combined with human conflict, could produce consequences beyond imagination. The same ingenuity that built cities and advanced medicine had been used to perfect methods of killing on an unprecedented scale. Humanity had unlocked a power it did not fully understand and could not decently restrain. Education and memory became crucial. Memorials were built not only to honor the dead, but to remind future generations of the cost of forgetting. The battle entered history books as a turning point, a moment when the modern world confronted the true nature of modern war. It served as both lesson and caution, though the extent to which that warning would be heeded remained uncertain. As Tampa said, new conflicts emerged, each shaped in some way by what had been learned here. Some innovations reduced certain dangers, while others introduced new ones. Yet the central truth revealed by this battle endured. War had become faster, larger, and more destructive than ever before, and no nation could claim immunity from its consequences. Looking back, this battle stands as more than a military event. It was a transformation of human experience. It redefined how societies viewed conflict, sacrifice, and responsibility. It forced the world to recognize that the tools humanity created could overwhelm the values it claimed to defend. This was the battle that proved war had changed forever. Not because it was the first to be violent, but because it revealed a future where violence could be endless, impersonal, and industrial. The legacy of that realization still shapes the world today, reminding us that the cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, and long after the final shot is fired.